In the cafes and restaurants,
Great to see you.
people are clinking their glasses and toasting the sunshine. But what's bubbling away is homegrown inflation, which in the UK is getting worse, not better. The UK inflation crisis has spread from an energy shock caused by Ukraine to what we pay in the supermarkets to the kind of wage price spiral we've been told to fear. Today's figures show that despite a whole series of interest rate rises, people are still spending in restaurants, going on holiday, buying concert tickets. And the worry is that the Bank of England will now have to unleash even more interest rate rises, going further for longer, and potentially pushing Britain into deep recession. The financial system has been addicted to cheap money for more than a decade. Coming off it won't be easy and holds serious risks. So says one of the big economic thinkers of our time.
If you push interest rates too high, you may be able to bring inflation down, but you will certainly push the economy into recession, and you will cause problems with the mortgage markets.
How likely is it for the UK now to go into recession?
I am really worried about this. I am very, very worried about this. I think the word stagflation, stag being the recession side of growth, inflation being high price inflation, is going to be something that you and me and others will say way too many times in the next few months.
While headline inflation has come off its peak, it's now stuck at 8.7%, and core inflation has actually gone up at 7.1%, a 31-year high, with services including restaurants, air travel and concert tickets shooting up to 7.4%. Energy prices have eased and even food costs are nudging down, though perhaps not in Borough Market. But as wages have climbed with people desperate to cover the cost of their bills, companies have passed on higher costs to consumers. Here, the bustle of spending is everywhere.
Is that for me? Thank you.
But for most families, the hope was that the cost of living crisis was on the wane, rather than digging in.
We're waiting for that moment. It just dips back down, but it's all on the rise again, so it's one of those.
We don't know when it's going to end and how long it's going to go on for. Like we knew it would be 3 months and everyone can sort of shoulder that a little bit. But if it's 6 months and if your mortgage is sort of, due now for renewal, then, you're paying a few hundred extra on that. So it does seem as though there is no end.
There is growing concern that inflation is hitting the UK harder than other countries. In Germany, where the economy has also struggled, inflation has come down, and the headline rate in France is now 6%, whereas in the US, price rises have fallen away dramatically to 2.7%. But here in the UK, the problem has become stuck, with no improvement since April. Is this a British disease?
We know that we are going through Brexit, where we are redefining supply chains. Things have become more expensive. We know that we've disrupted the labor market through Brexit, so labor is less available in certain sectors that have become very inflationary. We also know that we've underinvested in public services. We've been growing less than elsewhere for a number of years. So yes, there is a definite British accent, but inflation is a problem around the world. It's just worse in the UK. And the big social tragedy here, it is the most vulnerable segment of the population that are hit the hardest.
So what will the Bank of England do? Tomorrow it's expected to raise rates for the 13th time, but it's facing growing criticism that it's been dozing at the wheel. In Westminster, the realities of economic breakdown are now the battleground of every debate.
Will the Prime Minister tell us how much the Tory mortgage penalty is going to cost the average homeowner?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as ever, the honourable gentleman isn't aware of the global macroeconomic situation. But substantively,
perhaps the Prime Minister hasn't seen the latest international figures.
It's £2,900 extra. That's the cost to the average family of the Tory mortgage penalty.
let's just look at the facts. Let's look at the facts, because he talks about interest rates. He talks about interest rates. Perhaps the honourable gentleman could explain why interest rates are at similar levels in the United States, in Canada, in Australia and New Zealand.
But the decisions of the Central Bank of Canada won't be on the ballot paper next year. The performance of the government and the Bank of England to protect homeowners and households will be.
Well, I'm joined now by Giles Wilkes, a former economic advisor to Theresa May, and Vince Cable, now a partner at consultants Flint Global, and Kitty Ussher, chief economist at the Institute of Directors and previously a Labour Treasury Minister. Giles Wilkes first. When John Major was Chancellor in the 1980s and he was battling double-digit inflation, he said, if it's not hurting, it's not working. Is raising interest rates right now as perhaps it was then?
I'm afraid it is. I mean, the situation we're in is that we were too slow to raise interest rates, which is one of the reasons that domestic inflation, not just the energy bills that come from overseas, from the gas price and Vladimir Putin's war, the domestic inflation has gone way, way above the level we'd normally be comfortable with, and that's down to our domestic policies, the slowness of the interest rate rises over the last year, and the large amount of fiscal fuel that the government put into the economy through the COVID pandemic. So, although not many people anticipated it, it's clearly a domestic problem, and it's down to us domestically to solve it with tighter policy.
So, Kitty Ussher, has the bank been too slow all along, or do you blame government policy for not reacting quickly enough?
I think the bank has most certainly been too slow. They were slow off the blocks in September 2021 when, for example, our members at the Institute of Directors were telling us very, very clearly that they had no option but to pass through costs, and they were finding it really difficult to recruit. At the same time as the Bank of England was saying this is transitory and we're about to have high unemployment, which was completely untrue, as we told them at the time. And then, of course, they got their forecast so spectacularly wrong in the summer of last year, predicting the longest recession for a generation, which, of course, if you believe that, then you're probably less likely to put up interest rates because you think demand will be falling on its own. Thankfully, we aren't in that situation. Demand is much better. There's much more activity going on in the economy, certainly in the private sector. And so they're on the back foot then as well.
So, Giles Wilkes, does the bank now effectively need to kind of create a recession, regretfully, to bring inflation under control?
It may well need to, because as Kitty pointed out there, the economy has been much stronger than it anticipated, and the interest rate it's been pursuing has been too low. It needs to pursue whatever policy it is will bring inflation expectations down. Now, if everybody's asking for wages that are consistent with a much stronger and healthier economy, and everyone's asking for price rises that are, again, consistent with a much stronger economy, the only way they can convince people that inflation is going to come down is to slow things down themselves. Now, whether it has to be an out-and-out recession is still a bit of a coin flip. I think in America they might well be able to achieve what they call an immaculate disinflation. I suspect our situation is a little bit worse. We've damaged our supply chains. We need to accept that we're a little bit poorer, and that probably means a little bit of very weak or even negative growth.
Well, you talk about damaging supply chains there. Kitty Ussher, is this, you know, the fact that the UK is the worst hit in terms of inflation in the G7 and inflation's falling in the US and Germany, is that more than a little bit to do with Brexit and supply chain and labour shortages caused by that?
There's certainly a supply chain effect, but as we came out of the pandemic, the things that people wanted to buy were in the wrong parts of the world, and it took some time for that to unwind. But that
was so for every country. I mean, Brexit is a uniquely UK problem. Mm.
Yes, I think it's quite hard to disentangle the effect of Brexit on the inflation data. I would say that there are some peculiarly British situations. We seem to be a little slower in getting our exports back up to pre-pandemic levels. Whether there's we know that it's harder to import because from the EU, because EU companies quite understandably are finding it harder to get through the extra barriers into the UK. But I haven't seen a kind of proper piece of analysis that that's directly affecting inflation. There are other British issues going on. There may be something in some sectors around people working in minimum wage and just above type jobs that might have been affected by Brexit. But mainly the labour market effect is simply less people in the country wanting to offer their services into the labour market, particularly over 50s. And I'm sure that is having an effect, but it's hard to trace that back to Brexit.
Giles Wilkes, would you say Brexit is largely to blame for the worst picture on inflation in the UK?
I mean, most of the inflation comes from effects that are not Brexit. They come from, as I said, the large amount of fuel, the extra spending power we had, the impetus given by that absolutely extraordinary energy prices rise last year. However, I'd say that the small amount of difference between our position and our continental neighbours is probably something to do with Brexit, because after all, the analysis of the OBR and many others that it damages the economy by 3 or 4% has largely proven right. Some of the effects you'd see, like lower investment, lower flows of people, for example. Now, that effect can happen in two ways. One, you have less output, and two, you have higher prices. And I think we're having a combination of those two, and that's just going to carry on working its way through the system, I'm afraid.
Giles Wilkes and Kitty Ussher, thank you very much for joining us.